Okay, welcome to our session today. It's called Immersive Storytelling, Negotiating Identity. And this is our last session in this series, which we've called Negotiating Digital Space in Culturally Significant Storytelling. It is a cross-cultural and interdisciplinary webinar series. Sorry. There was a backlog there from YouTube. Sorry about that. So as I was telling you, this is Negotiating Digital Space and Culturally Significant Storytelling. It is organized by the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats in association with the Bachelor of Media Production and Design Program School of Journalism at Carleton University and the Bachelor of Interior Design Program at Algonquin College in Ottawa. It is supported by a Shirk Connections grant and as well as Art Engine and Carleton Immersive Media Studio. It ran from July 16th to July 28th, which is today, our last session, and explored the multifaceted concept of storytelling and how digital technology is expanding on the storytelling toolkit. So I welcome all of you and thank you, Dylan and Maze, who are our speakers today, who Katie will be introducing shortly. Thank you for coming to present for this series. So today's session is called Immersive Storytelling, Negotiating Identity. We explore how video games tell stories and how and what games communicate. On the screen and within a virtual reality headset, video games become an extension and representation of the creator as they determine the game mechanics and aesthetics. Although games are created for an audience, they can reflect on the identity of the creator. So Dylan Perret and Maze Longboat ask what it means to create a video game or experience that reflects their identities. As they each navigate what it means to create a queer or Indigenous game, respectively, they explore how game design can create a conversation between creator and user. So I welcome both of you, and I pass on the screen now to Katie, who will introduce them as well as the session. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you both very much for being here today. Just before we get started, I just wanted to say how great this session's been in general for them. This is the last one. And although we're in virtual space, I think it's important, especially since it's the last one, to make sure that we acknowledge that the land on which we gather, both for Pallavi and I, we're both in Ottawa, and this is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I feel like often when we're in virtual space, we forget that we should still remember the land that we're, the background of where we are in, especially when we're thinking about storytelling, because Ottawa, the story is only one narrative of where we are, and we should remember that there are others, and that we are part of the Algonquin Nation, or on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. Okay. And with that, I want to introduce our two speakers today. We're going to begin with Dylan Perret, who is a PhD candidate in the learning sciences at the University of Calgary, Workland School of Education. They are the founder and director of Queer Code, an award-winning studio that designs and researches virtual reality and interactive computer-based learning environments for learning about issues related to gender, sexuality, intersecting marginalization. Dylan's primary research project reimagines computational literacies by interweaving community storytelling with scholarships on complexity studies, embodied learning, and queer and trans phenomenology. So thank you very much, Dylan, for being here. I'm going to also introduce Maze, but then I'm going to hand over the share Zoom function to Dylan. So Maze Longboat is from the Mohawk family at Six Nations of the Grand River and was raised on the unceded territory of the Squamish Nation near Vancouver, BC. He is a partner relations manager with Unity Technologies and served as Skins Workshop Associate Director with Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace and the Initiative for Indigenous Futures from 2019 to 2021. He holds an MA in Media Studies from Concordia University, and his master's research examined Indigenous video game development through the production of his own game, Terra Nova, award-winning cooperative platformer with an interactive narrative. So thank you both very much for being here. I'm going to pass it over to Dylan. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let them share their screen. So thank you.
Sorry, 1 second. Okay, I think that should be up now.
Yes,
Great.
you're good to go.
Thank you. So yeah, I just want to start off by saying thank you so much for having me here for this great webinar series. It's a really interesting space, and I love that I'm going to be in conversation with you all and with Maze about immersive storytelling, about negotiating identity, and to have this opportunity to really delve into that topic with all of you. So there we go. So I wanted to start by acknowledging the land that I'm on. So I'm presenting from Mohkinstsis on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. And Mohkinstsis is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And I won't be going into all of our projects in this presentation. I'll just be focusing primarily on one of them. But just to give an overview, as sort of the team of Queer Code, over the last few years, we've been thinking through a number of different projects in how to work, how to create technologies for people to engage with for learning about gender and sexuality. So we've covered a number of different formats. One is agent-based modeling, which is also, you can kind of think of these projects as a documentary interactive art. And we've done some immersive virtual reality projects, and as well as a short documentary with a complementary 360-degree film. And the film is about trans youth thinking about their futures and designing them with virtual reality art tools. So it also kind of crosses over into that virtual reality space. And most of these projects are available to interact with on our website, Queer Code, and so you can check some of them out there. The perspective that I'm coming from, and so this is also attached to my dissertation research, so when I'm looking at designing these technologies, as well as researching people's interactions with them, I'm thinking a lot with Sarah Ahmed's work on queer phenomenology, and this line that she talks about here, this compulsory heterosexuality diminishes the very capacity of bodies to reach what is off the straight line. So thinking about this, how we are oriented within the world by others, other people, and by objects, and how that affects how and whether we can extend ourselves into the world. And what's really neat about this is when we're thinking about these virtual spaces, the virtual space becomes the world by which we can change and design who's in that space, both sort of like in an actual sense of a person is in there, but also in the characters that we create, and what are the objects that are in this space that people can interact with. And so I'm thinking through in my designs this question of how can we use immersive virtual reality to reorient objects and people in ways that extend queerness and queer lives into the world. And so from this, I'm developing this phenomenology of reorientation. And so starting from Sarah Ahmed's work on these queer orientations, how we oriented towards the straight line, how can we then design for that reorientation? And I argue that the work of reorienting oneself involves an active and continual resistance to the normative forces that impose docility. And a phenomenology of reorientation attends to experiences of recognizing normative forces and orienting oneself with counter-hegemonic and non-normative actions in people. And so I think I'm hearing a feedback
Pallavi,
loop.
there's an echo. Can you please turn off the microphone? Thanks.
Thank you. So when I'm looking at like these this sort of orienting towards the straight line, in order to reorient oneself, we have to recognize that normative force that's orienting us in that way, and then look at how can we reorient towards these counter-hegemonic, towards a non-normative action. And kind of what this can look like is, this is a bit of a binary, and I don't mean to reinforce these ideas of binaries, but it can be helpful to think through sort of these different ways of how this works in practice. And so, a queer or trans phenomenological approach centers marginalized people's experiences of oppression, restraint, erasure, and silencing by normative and disciplinary forces that relate to gender and sexuality and the intersecting axes of marginalization. But at the same time, we need to also recognize that this approach should also center marginalized people's experiences of joy, desire, love, community, intimacy, imagination, futurity, world building, and resistance and survival under normative oppressive forces, because all of those things matter in recognizing the fullness of who we are as humans. And so while a lot of media about marginalized people really focuses on the negative side, the oppression, that can end up sort of taking away a sense of agency from the people who experience that marginalization, where in this other space of joy and community and all these others, that's where we see agency, that's where we see the ways that people go about living their lives under and resist and survive oppression. So what I'm going to focus on is one of our projects called Mementorium. And this one is not yet released, though it has shown at some festivals and conferences. And this one is one of our more recent projects that was funded by Meta Oculus in their Launchpad program. And so this one, I am in the process of studying this one for my dissertation, analyzing data currently and presenting on it. But what this one is about is it's a virtual reality interactive story about identity development and belonging in STEM learning environments. And STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math. And it follows a character's life experiences from about early childhood up to early adulthood. And it's told in sort of moments, and there's a and by interacting with objects that uncover memories of this character's past, and it's like 5 moments throughout their life that are uncovered and then further delved into, and so the purpose and kind of what we're trying to do with this one is to tell this interactive branching narrative in a way that supports people's reasoning across the character's perspective as well as the player's perspective. And so one of the drawbacks, or sort of the challenges that we're dealing with in virtual reality storytelling over the last few years is that a lot of people, especially at the beginning, were saying, "Oh, VR is an empathy machine. If you just kind of put people into the shoes of another, they'll experience the trauma and then understand." And so there's been a lot of pushback about this from a number of people, and in the ways that we never fully lose our sense of who we are when we're interacting in these spaces, when we're interacting with another character's experiences. And so we're always bringing ourselves to these stories. And when I was writing this, I wanted to really think through what does that mean as we're both becoming or playing as the character, somebody else, and bringing our own selves to that. And so the other things that I wanted to sort of support through this interactive storytelling was developing an understanding of marginalization and resilience as an interpersonal, structural, and cumulative phenomenon. So something that happens between people within larger structures of society, and also that these moments sort of have a cumulative effect as we go through our lives. And also to support centering the character's agency while also encouraging the player's reflection upon the interpersonal and structural limitations and possibilities for resilience. So in talking about the branching storytelling, I wanted to show a little snapshot of one of the branches in its rough form. So the initial drafts were written in Twine, and it's a program that allows you to write interactive narratives. And so when I was creating these branching stories, they kind of went through levels, where the first level, you're opening the memory of the narrator's experience of marginalization. And then at the second level, that's where you're transported into this magical realm where it becomes the reflective space where the objects are have been changed in some way that sort of queers the objects in the environment. And so at the second level, you go deeper into the narrator's experience of harm, fully reflecting on what that experience was. And then at the third level, we see the branches, you start to have more consequential decisions for the player, where at this level, the player has to choose the character's emotional reaction to this past experience of harm. And so in that moment of choosing an emotion, it's a way of trying to create a connection between the player and the character, where it gives the player an opportunity to think about their own emotions, or to sort of have their own emotions reflected with the character, and it creates that kind of connection there. And then at the fourth level, we have the player will choose how the narrator makes sense of their experience, and by doing by sort of acknowledging the harms that happen and finding a way forward. And this fourth choice is both based on some of the narrative therapy techniques of restorying, but also each of those choices reflects a kind of the different types of resources that someone might have in order to find agency. And that might be something that's just a sort of at a smaller interpersonal level. It might be more directed towards group level change, or potentially even more structural change, and more like larger activist kind of work. And so again, at that point, it's encouraging the player to think through what is possible, and both what happens when people are playing this is they're thinking about both their own resources in their life, and what they would choose, but also what what the player, or sorry, what the narrator might be able to choose. And at each of these levels, as they're sort of making choices and unlocking more story, they're in conversation with the narrator, who's then also thinking through each of these choices with them. And so when you have what we have here is, so we went from this sort of rough mapping out of these story branches to then taking this into the VR space, and you can see a small GIF at the bottom right that shows one of the interactions and how this looks in the magical realm, where the character is making choices based on these sticky notes. And so the objects that are used to tell the story are connected into the story, to the time in the character's life, and to kind of what might be going on for them that's eliciting this moment in their life. So what I was trying to do is to move away from this kind of, just put someone into a traumatic experience and they'll then, so much, understand what that experience is and develop empathy, trying to sort of challenge that and move towards what are some other ways we can tell stories that acknowledge that we can't remove people's own experiences and we can't make them feel how another person feels. However, we can ask them to make a story choice and align that action and the emotions to the marginalized person's experience, and in that way support perspectival thinking, so thinking from other perspectives. And in creating these narratives, one of the challenges is this question of who is the audience for a queer and trans game, and what does it mean to write a queer story for a broad audience? And the challenge there is that you can't write the story for everyone, but you can sort of think through who is that audience. So when I was thinking through writing this, there's so many different people who could potentially be playing this. There's the queer and trans people who are more knowledgeable about queer issues, histories, or aesthetics. The people who are learning this, then, I leave an open sentence there, because there's so many intersections of experience that can change what people bring to this. There's, straight and cisgender people who are knowledgeable, who are learning, who are hostile, and more, right? There's so many different experiences that people bring to their gameplay, that it really is a challenge to just sort of think about one audience. But for me, what I'm aiming for is to create for people who are interested in learning. And in particular, at least in my dissertation work, in the designs that I'm doing for that, I'm interested in working through how do we develop something, or how do we develop people's sociological ways of thinking about gender and sexuality? So I'm asking questions of how do people learn in interaction with a virtual reality interactive fiction game? How do their identities and histories shape how they make sense of the game narrative and the objects in the game? And how can the design of the game elements support learning about gender and sexuality? And so that's a lot of what I'm sort of looking at now and analyzing in my data. But the other part of this is that any creator, as they're making something, it becomes an extension of the creator. And so I want to talk a little bit about how the work that I'm making is also an extension of myself, and my interests, my identities. And so even in Mementorium, for instance, it contains some of my own personal stories, somewhat fictionalized, but also some other stories who I've included by permission. And so the stories that exist in Mementorium are really true to people's real life experiences. They're things that have actually happened to somebody, myself, another person, or sometimes it's also from the research that I've done. But I draw upon my own experience of many years of working as a community organizer, educator, and researcher on gender and sexuality. And so I have, for a very long time, done a lot of the sort of trainings about gender and sexuality. So when I'm thinking through each of those levels of responses in the narrative, I'm drawing upon the ways that that I've seen people react in trainings that I've done in the past, and sort of what comes up for people, and thinking about, how do I anticipate that and make that part of the story choices. And so how that kind of like, how do we recognize what people might be bringing to the table, bringing into this experience, and then how do we work with that? But the other part is that I also have my own interests in LGBTQ plus histories and aesthetics. And so, there's many moments in the designs that I make that reflect these histories and aesthetics that might be lost on most players, and that's okay. They're often, really deep cuts. But for example, there's in the first story of Mementorium, we take sort of the classic old pixel style side scroller games of, Mario running to the castle at the end, and then sort of do a queer spin on that, where we have the game Kitty Castle Raid, and our little cat knight is running to the castle at the end of the story choices. And you see that the castle has a queer and a trans flag on it. But the even deeper cut here is that it's actually, this game is referencing a moment in queer Canadian history where in the past there were raids on the lesbian bathhouse in Toronto called Pussy Palace. And so this is actually a deep cut about that moment in history, and the raids that were a real experience for people there. So as I'm just finishing up here, I just wanted to acknowledge my co-designers, my team, who I've worked with very closely for the last few years. They're wonderful people. We have a picture here of us at the Yoda Fountain in San Francisco, and that's John on the left and Scout on the right. And I also want to just acknowledge my funding sources, and I really appreciate everything that's gone into making this this work possible.
So thank you very much, Dylan. That was fantastic. I have many thoughts and questions, but I'm going to hold off and hand over the Zoom share screen function to Maze. And so Maze, you can start when you're ready.
Great, will do. Can y'all see my first slide?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dylan. That was great. Loved hearing about your work. You can already see a lot of the overlaps happening with some of the stuff that I've done in the past. So I'm looking forward to the conversation after I'm done chatting here. But I also want to say big nyalgo and thank you to Pallavi and Katie for inviting me here and to be a part of this conversation. I always love having the opportunity to talk a little bit about my game, Terra Nova, just kind of like what I went through in terms of like the development process, but also kind of what I've learned since producing this game. So yeah, I'll dig right in. So Sego Sebaguego, my name is Maze. Like it's said in the bio, I'm Mohawk from Six Nations of the Grand River. And currently I'm joining you from Hamilton, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas of the Credit peoples, and also governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. So like I said, I'm going to talk about my game, Terra Nova, what it's about, how it was created, and what I've come to learn since completing the project back in 2019. And yeah, I also completed my Master's of Arts in Media Studies at Concordia back in 2019. And this research, this creating this game was part of that. And now I'm a senior developer relations manager at Unity Technologies. I love leading with this photo because it shows just like who I am. I'm like this gamer at heart. I've been kind of obsessed with games since as long as I can remember. And I definitely belong to this generation of like always having tech in and around my life, whether it be at home or out at school with computer labs, or like at friends' houses with, you know, various game consoles and all this. So yeah, I'm definitely part of that like digital native generation, which is kind of funny as like a hard person to say. But I guess yeah, this photo just kind of encapsulates that kind of early interest and obsession with games. And then also probably like one of my fondest memories from this time is actually like going to the Blockbuster and being able to rent like a Game Boy Color with the Pokemon Blue game, and just having that for a weekend, and it being just like the biggest treat of my life as a young person. And I mean, Pokemon was like a really big cultural phenomenon all over the world for a lot of people. But I think for me, what I found so interesting, apart from like the cool monsters you could collect in battle, was just the fact that you could explore a world as though you yourself were the character exploring the world. So that classic like role-playing game element, projecting yourself and your identity and, you know, your perspective of the world into the world of this interactive game, and basically like, yeah, putting yourself in that character's shoes and role playing in that way. And so fast forward a couple years later into like kind of the early aughts, I guess, like 2005, 2006, and the creation of World of Warcraft made this kind of like brought new perspective to me as like a gamer, because this was the first time I ever saw Indigenous representation in a role-playing style game, and being able to play as these characters who they're called Tauren. They're like this race of character that you can play as in this role-playing game, and they are very heavily and stereotypically based off of like the classic Hollywood Native American tropes of like Western films and stuff. So they're wearing like feathers and buckskin, and they pray to this Earth Mother God, and it's all kind of quite reductionist and awful. And I don't think that there were many cultural consultations when these characters were being created, you know, in the Blizzard studios in Southern California. However, as a young, you know, 11, 12-year-old, seeing this as an option for me definitely sparked something in me where I felt an even greater connection to the type of character that I could be. Like, not only could I be just, you know, myself as a Pokemon trainer in the world of Pokemon, I could also be, you know, an Indigenous character in a world that Indigenous characters were also in and inhabiting. But again, I want to stress that this is very complex. I'm not in any way condoning this. I think the representation aspect could be done almost like infinitely better, because, you know, this idea of like proper representation in media is a growing and ongoing and ever changing thing. But at the time, I think it was something that was key for me in my understanding of games and what could be possible in games. Because by the time I went to, you know, do my undergrad at the University of British Columbia and in the Indigenous Studies program there, I started looking into Indigenous games as like my primary research interest. So yeah, and primarily like digital games in that sphere. So with the creation of Never Alone, this game that I'm picturing in the bottom half here, it was published in 2014 and created by Upper One Games and Eline Media in direct, I guess, connection and consultation with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council in Alaska, which is an Inupiaq community. And I don't know, there's been a lot written about Never Alone, and it's very like critically acclaimed, and I think it's because it is a story that comes from directly from the community, and it's done in like a double A type budget, which means basically like, you know, it has a lot of money. You can create a nice looking thing that plays well. A lot of resources, you know, both time and money have gone into it, and it just shows that clearly people within the community that, you know, told this story about this girl and her fox friend, and you know, their quest to save the village was done directly in consultation with community members. And so it kind of, this was the game that kind of inspired me to look a little bit deeper and further, and see what other games are being created by Native folks out there. And two examples of those are the other images. So in 2017, Elizabeth LaPonce, who's an Anishinaabe and Métis, I should say Dr. Elizabeth LaPonce, she's a professor, created this game called Thunderbird Strike, where you play as this like omnipotent Thunderbird spirit, basically like revitalizing the land from extractive industry development, and also like resurrecting animal life that exists in this area. And what's really cool about this game from a mechanical perspective is that it's impossible to lose. Like the Thunderbird is like inevitable in its kind of power against the environment and the beings and I guess industry infrastructures that it's coming encountering with. So a lot of games have like lose states where you know, Mario jumps off into a hole and you lose a life, but and then you get a game over if you do it too much. But this game is unique in that it does not allow you to lose. The land will always be kind of revitalized no matter what you do in it. And it's also beautiful. It's beautiful, like kind of style of art that does look quite culturally grounded. And then on the top left there is a game called Bob Kanaka, which was made in 2018. And I was actually played a small part in this creation. I was with the Initiative for Indigenous Futures and Aboriginal Territories in cyberspace at the time. And this game was created by the Kale Milika'a collective of mostly Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian youth in Honolulu over a 3-week workshop. And basically, you know, that workshop was done under like the Skins digital media workshops, which are, you know, teach Indigenous youth how to create video games and other forms of digital art. And it was great because it was basically taking, you know, folks who had never made a game before, who had only done a little bit of game production, and equip them with the skills to create a game that like they wrote and developed from beginning to end over a 3-week span. So yeah, I was here kind of contributing to aspects of the game as like one of the participants, but then also helping with the production aspect, making sure things were organized and on time. And it just really synced up well with where I wanted to take my research. And that research ended up being this. So my project was entitled Terra Nova: Enacting Video Game Development Through Indigenous-Led Creation. You know, it was a combination thesis and creation project. So I guess research creation, where I went and embarked on creating my own game as part of that process. And that turned out to be Terra Nova, which I'll talk a little bit more about soon. But the academic written aspect of it was kind of guided by this main primary research question, which is what makes a video game Indigenous, and how would the game I create be informed by my own experience as an Indigenous person? So kind of alluding to the fact that you kind of, if you're to make an Indigenous game, you almost have to fold identity and knowledge and personal experience into the production itself. So yeah, so Terra Nova, I'll talk about now, is a game that is yeah, kind of, well, what is it? I'm kind of looking at my notes here, but I'm trying to, how do I phrase this? So Terra Nova, before it was Terra Nova, you know, I knew I wanted to create a game. This was the first time I was making it, and I needed something to go off of because I'd never made a game before. So I started with this central theme of exploring what first contact between an indigenous and settler peoples might look like in the distant future. And I think where that motivation came from was just kind of reading and experiencing like a lot of science fiction media, and also reading like historical records, because I'd done a bit of history studies in my undergrad, just about what happened during colonization, in that moment of like meeting between the two peoples, indigenous and settler, colonizer and colonized. What went on? We were kind of told that all of a sudden white folks from Europe were here, and then some stuff happened, but now like we have what we have around us now. And I was really interested in like that moment, like what happened. Was it a confusing moment for everybody? Was it scary? Was it joyous? Did they fight one another? What happened? And I'm sure we can look back in historical written texts and also oral histories to get some of those answers. But I thought that actually setting this game in the distant future, I'd be able to kind of put my own narrative spin on it and kind of define it. So the game takes place on Earth, far in the distant future, long after this environmental catastrophe forced some subset of humanity to abandon the planet and attempt to settle on another planet elsewhere, a better planet, I guess, because they had ruined this one. But there was a group of humans that had to stay. And so they eventually kind of built up this new society and forgot about the ones that had left them. And similarly, the ones that had left forgot where they kind of came from. And so in this version of the future Earth, the planet continues to heal while these kind of high water levels from the melted polar ice caps cause erratic weather patterns. So the humans there have kind of adapted to their environment and are now just kind of living peacefully. And the humans that are there kind of live high atop these overgrown, ruined structures to escape those high water levels. But I should speak a little bit about this image. This is the first piece of concept art that was created that was kind of meant to reflect the setting with which this game takes place in. And I worked with a super talented artist and illustrator, Ray Capelin, who's Mi'kmaq from Listugush. And Ray ended up doing all of the art and animation for this game eventually. So that was a little bit about the Earth-born humans, but then there's also kind of the humans from space, those starborn folks. The game kind of begins when their spaceship crash lands back on Earth, and they come in contact once again after kind of millennia. And so you experience, it's a 2-player cooperative game, so you experience both perspectives, one through the eyes of Tara, who's an elder from the indigenous community on Earth, and then also Nova, who's this young inventor youth from space. And so Tara kind of witnesses the crash, and she's kind of sent out to investigate and this big spaceship, while Nova is kind of separated from his family and he needs to make it back to the spaceship. So that's kind of where the story begins. And again, this piece of concept art was created to kind of represent, what was the space people's ship. Like, what was that supposed to look like? And these are the first character concepts for Tara. She's kind of older, but she's like very physically capable, and she has a lot of knowledge from her age and her position within the community. And then also Nova is kind of contained within this spacesuit, and he's got all these gadgets and very inquisitive fellow. But this is kind of where you start game development. You have an idea, you start piecing it together, you just write it down, and then you kind of go and you create some visual elements to kind of begin building the foundation of what the game was actually going to look and feel like. These are some of the kind of concept characters that would be as part of the world. some indigenous folks, and also space folks, and a robot. And so this is kind of what the game actually ended up looking like. So the game's in a 2D pixel art style. This was kind of like the first attempt at creating a scene using that style that Ray did. And I think it looks very, very similar to the original concept art that we did. And this is what you kind of see in the game. And then similarly, these are the characters that you play as in the game. They're on the left and Nova on the right. And pretty much this is almost their final form. There are some subtle changes in the final game. But this is kind of what the game looks like. So it's a split screen perspective. And like I mentioned before, it's 2 players. So you need two people to play and complete the game. One player plays as Terra on the left and one player plays as Nova on the right. And basically you're kind of just walking around, jumping around, and interacting with objects and characters that are all around you. And so as you kind of progress through the narrative, and Terra is sent to investigate, and Nova's kind of searching around, exploring, trying to find his community. The 2 meet, and they have this moment of first contact that I described before, which is like, how would they react to seeing, aliens respectively together? How would that go? Yeah, I play a lot with duality in this work, and like really kind of pushing against some of the common narratives around sci-fi. Us versus them, aliens versus humans, and just really play with the gray area, because I think a lot of the time we maybe would do things we wouldn't expect in this moment, and that's kind of the I guess special part of this game is that when the 2 characters meet, it almost becomes a totally different game, where you're no longer separated by this black bar in the middle of the screen. You actually start cooperating to progress to the end of the game together. And I won't really spoil, what that experience is like if you want to go play it, but this is kind of the foundation and some of the concepts I was thinking of in cooperation being kind of what I was encouraging players to do instead of competing or whatever. Oftentimes this is like a big theme in games. So trying to do things a little bit differently. And I'll also talk a little bit about the production, because as Dylan knows, it takes a village to make a game. Truly, it's very rare to find individual solo developers that can do everything. They do exist, and there are some amazing games out there that are made by one person. Usually they take a very long time, but I was really lucky enough to bring on some people who actually have game development experience. As mine was very limited when I set out to start this project. So I brought on 3 people in addition to myself, and was able to pay them with a SSHRC graduate grant as well. And that was Mehrdad, our technical director. He was responsible for programming and some of the design and integration of like some of the features, and also like advising me on like what would be a good thing to do versus what would be a harder thing to do. We also had the artist, Ray. He did all of the 2D art. So everything visual that you see in the game, he is responsible for. He's also a very talented animator, so he made kind of the world come alive and move. And then we also had Beatrix Mersch, who is the sound designer. She basically created all the ambience and the audio effects and brought the audio to life in the game. And then me on the end there, I'm kind of the producer / creative director. I kind of managed the project. I wrote the narrative and kind of explained the vision for what I was hoping for it to happen, and also did a little bit of work in the engine, and also got to pay people, which was really cool. That's a really big part of this project, actually, is like not just having a good idea, but how do you execute and how do you compensate people fairly for their time and effort. It's super important, and I felt very lucky to be able to do that, because isn't always something that gets to happen, when you're doing master's or even PhD research, especially with like a creative element. So yeah, this was a big part of it. So I guess just to conclude, for me, I think Terra Nova as a game like whole represents me as a developer, and an indigenous developer that also holds like a settler identity as well. So I really wrote this game from my experience and perspectives, both from like the perspective of Terra as like an indigenous character and Nova as a non-indigenous character, as dual protagonists, and as well as like the world that they came from. So yeah, I do definitely see a lot of overlap with kind of what Dylan was talking about. And I think that, when we're talking about folding into identities into our projects, I think it's super important to kind of show what you know, essentially, and kind of lean into that. And I think it makes really good for really good work, for really good projects. So I think I will leave it there, and just kind of plug the game here at the end. You can go play it, either download it for PC on itch.io, or you can play it right in the browser on the website there. So if you just search my name and Terra Nova, you'll be able to find it if you want to go play it for yourself. Yeah, I will hand it back over to Katie, and we can open up the discussion, I guess.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. I have many streams of thoughts. Both of you guys are doing, using video games and immersive technologies to explore ideas and for storytelling is exactly up my niche as well. And it's really nice to see the different perspectives. And actually, I think that's where I want to start my first kind of question, which is about the different perspectives, the different points of view, and both of you have that kind of play. I'll start maybe with a more direct question for Dylan, and then I'll follow with a more direct question for Maze. Dylan, I really liked the idea of how you dealt with, instead of having it become the person becomes the person that they are, they're more of like, they're not the they're not the narrator, but they're also not like the godlike view. It's more of like they're participating. And I really liked how that worked with the idea of agency. And I was maybe wanting to hear more about maybe how the play with the agency of the control versus the lack of control kind of helped make your decisions.
Yeah, it was it's sort of how should I answer? I mean, I guess in thinking through it, it's this you kind of meet all of these different moments of these design choices, and so like right from the beginning, you're having to make choices about like how do we embody the character, like how should you be in the world, because you have to have some kind of visual representation, and so we went really pared back, where you literally only have hands, and your hands in the game are actually styled with a how to describe it. We had a wonderful artist, Acela. You can look her up on our website, but she did these constellation and star motifs. So like what happens is that on your hands you have these, it's like a blue night sky with like stars on them, and then whenever you interact with like these objects that are meaningful to the story, these constellations appear on your hands, and it's sort of this crossover between elements of science and story, and how do humans look at something like the stars and make stories about it, and that's how we make sense of the world. And so in terms of this player agency, you're embodying the narrator. You come into the room, that's their past room, and the first line is, where am I? Oh, this is my old room. And so it's establishing that you are the narrator, but and the narrator's voice is always sort of in your head. But at the same time, there's all these, because of the way that you have to make these story choices, you're always having to sort of remember that you're making a choice for somebody else. You're drawing on your own resources. It's like this kind of moments of like almost separating you from like sort of separating you from the narrator to make these decisions, but then you're back in it and you're having to sort of go back into like, oh, now I'm reflecting on that choice. And in a way, it almost kind of is similar to how we think about our own lives, in that there's moments where we're completely embodied and completely immersed in our own lives and we're very present. And then there's those moments where we're sort of disconnected and having to think through, who am I? What do I want? How am I going to move forward? And you are sort of in an almost third person to yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, very much. It's almost like if you're in a dream and you're unable to fully control it. It reminds me in some ways, there's a TV show that I'm currently watching. I won't plug it, but where one of the characters keeps going into different like different people in the past, family members, trying to change something, but she can't. And it's that you feel like you have agency, you have control, but then at the same point, the overall environment is not yours. You don't belong.
Yeah.
And
yeah, exactly. And that's you only ever have so much agency. And even as we're reflecting on these moments in the game that are the past, it's not like we can just make the harm not exist. That moment is always going to be there. So what do we do with it? How do we process that? How do we think through it? How do we decide how to move forward?
Yeah. And then so kind of same types of question, but Maze, the sides, the split screen idea and how you're having to play together. I'm wondering when that's going on, does it matter? Like if you're playing, does the ability for the other person to play the game successfully matter? Like, how does that work with the two different people have different skill levels playing?
Yeah, it is one of those intentional design decisions to make it like kind of sit on the couch or at the desk and play the game together as both characters, the two people. And I've definitely encountered a few times where the game's been played where, yeah, one person's very experienced, they understand, platforming mechanics, they can run, they can jump, they can, do all the things very easily, and the other person maybe struggles a little bit more. I tried to design the game to be where, like, if you had played video games for the first time, you'd be able to complete it. And even like having people locally together looking at the same thing, and say one is more experienced and one knew that if that was the case, it would start a like kind of like a para conversation, not within the game, but amongst the two players to say, oh, I had success doing it this way. Maybe you should try it like that. Or maybe we should just switch controllers for a couple minutes and I'll like get through, that tricky stage together. So yeah, you can, if you don't make a jump, you in the game, you kind of just fall and you get, reset and like right at the jump again. You can try it again over and over again until you make it. So it's not very penalizing for newer type players as well. And I think I actually could have designed it to be even easier, because it's really like that's not what the game's about. The game's not really about like challenging people and how accurate they can be and where they step with the characters, but more about like what is try to make the environment as immersive as possible, kind of put little environmental storytelling elements to kind of flesh out the world here and there. And then obviously like the main focal point I want people to experience is like the moment where the two characters meet and have a first contact experience and choose the narrative, reactions to one another in a way that, they feel that sense of agency.
Great. Is there ever a moment where you get to be the other person? Is there a crossover, or are you always on one side looking at the other?
There's no kind of like programmed element where you swap perspectives, but I would just say, if you like the game and you played it as one character, play it again as the other character, maybe with a new person or with the same person, and see like what you have in terms of experience and like how it compares and contrasts.
Yeah, definitely playable. You can play it more than once. So actually this brings me to the idea that both of your projects are well, Maze, you specifically said it was a research creation project. Dylan, I'm assuming yours would classify like you classify it as well. And so how when you're making a research creation project, especially a game, how much of what you're doing is thinking about the playability, the person who's playing the game versus your discovery of the information and the research through it? I don't know who wants to start with the question because it's for both of you. Maybe Maze, are you good to start with that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about it a lot during my research because my master's was kind of structured where I took my courses, I drafted my proposal, and then as soon as the proposal was accepted by my committee, they're like, okay, like go make the game now, and I'm like, all right, well, let's do this. And so that was like the big like learning moment, was like, okay, how do I actually get this thing off the ground? How do I like treat it with the care that it needs, so that like I'm kind of setting myself up for the most success possible? So I got as far as I could, like building out the framework, and then a lot of that work of like, okay, how can this be playable actually happened like after we actually started with like the small team. So like I didn't even know that it was going to be a side-scrolling platformer when I started and like hired people. I like worked with Merdad and like asked him like what would be possible in our timeline, and he was really, really helpful, lending his expertise. And it was either like going to be kind of more like an open world thing where you like kind of walk around as each character, maybe again in split screen or maybe together. But I'm really happy with how it kind of ended up here, because I feel like platformers are quite legible. Like it's to players, like it's a genre that's been out for a really long time in games. And it's kind of easy to just, even if you've never played games before, to say, okay, here's your controller, hold this and start pressing buttons and like see what it does. And then, from there, like, where you can kind of go. You can go left, you can go right, you can go up if there's, a place to jump. And oh, look, there's a word that pops up over this. Maybe I can like press a button and something will happen, and that's not what happens. So try to keep the design as like easy as possible to again make it as approachable for as many types of players as possible. I haven't really heard many folks come to me and say, oh, like I don't get this, I don't understand, which I'm very thankful for. It means I like thought about that enough to where it was acceptable enough for people to get far in the narrative. But yeah, definitely something I was thinking of at the beginning. I did not want to make some like highly skill based I don't know, like Twitch shooter, or something. I really wanted to make something that was accessible and legible to people.
And what about Dylan? Turning the question to you.
Yeah, so like one of the, I guess in terms of like what was happening at the time that we were making this game, so we were kind of on a deadline. It had to be made in about 7 months, and so everything was pretty fast. But at the same time, as I was writing the narrative, for instance, I was also writing some of the early drafts of a paper that's kind of the theoretical and literature background for my dissertation. And so I was thinking through the research and the literature at the same time that I was writing this narrative. So they did really influence each other in terms of like, what focuses kind of I have in the narrative were very much like influenced by the research I was doing. But at the same time, it was also thinking about the practical side of designing a virtual reality experience. And it's a new genre of game making. It has, in some ways it can rely on some of the same mechanics and the knowledge that we have about previous forms of video games, but it also has like different sort of challenges where if you have a brand new user, they don't even know how to necessarily move in the space. And so you're having to think through all of this, like, how do we make movement easy? How do we make sure we're not going to make people sick? How do we make sure that it's short enough that people who are not used to VR are not going to have fatigue wearing, the big clunky headsets. And so, all of those things are challenges as well. But when you're designing how to interact with objects, we were trying to sort of keep it interesting, and sort of like in some ways like push things to be kind of push the capabilities of VR, but you can only push it so far before people are just like, well, what am I supposed to do here? So I had many conversations with my team members about how we designed each of the interactions with the different objects in the world, and in some ways you're trying to think through like, because VR is so embodied, some of the interactions can kind of rely on our own everyday sort of embodied knowledge of how we interact with objects. Like you pick this up, you grab it, that kind of stuff. But because it's in a virtual space, it's all digital, and we were trying to also work with this magical realism, surrealistic kind of style. We were also trying to be like, okay, how do we make it like a little bit not like everyday life, not like super intuitive and that kind of thing, but still playable? It was a challenge.
Yeah, definitely. I know I have many other things to ask or talk about, but I know Pallavi as well wanted to ask something, so I'm going to pass it over to her to ask.
Well, thank you, Dylan and Ms. Very interesting presentations. And again, my background is in design and mostly architectural interior design. So when I look at the graphics of your games, that immediately interests me. And I start thinking of how did you think of, especially the environmental storytelling that you're doing, definitely the character, but also the environment that you're placing them. For example, Maze, you went into detail about, how you went, the concept art remained very minimalistic, or, it remained concept art. And I thought that was really compelling. And I wanted to hear more about it from both of you, as not only in character design, definitely the identity of the character, but the identity of anyone is also very much defined by the environment that they are in. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a super exciting topic for me to talk about, because even before I knew like who the characters of Terra and Nova were going to be in the game, I was first thinking about like the two worlds with which they would be like essentially like born from, right? Because it's like, okay, so you have, this indigenous Earth, future Earth type place, and kind of thinking about it as like a post-apocalyptic Earth. So something happened. There was an apocalypse, and then there was whatever came after the apocalypse was probably really awful, but then we were past that, so it was post, and try to make it like kind of not good, because life isn't good, all the time. There are good elements, there are bad elements, but like try to make it like this believable space where this carnage of the past was kind of just normal, and it had already been processed and dealt with, and something new and wonderful had been created. But not without like the danger of this like kind of environment that was still undergoing like kind of like kind of a different climate than what we have now, right? Like more inhospitable, I guess you could say, or just more destructive or dramatic. And then contrasting that with kind of like this sterile spaceship environment that Nova starts in, and like doing a lot of like contrasting work visually, but then trying to break it down and make it so that almost didn't matter as much once you kind of got to that first contact moment element and started to see the gray areas between the two worlds, and like literally the two worlds colliding and becoming one single frame perspective instead of a split screen perspective in the game. So again, trying to make the indigenous and settler worlds distinct and dual, but then breaking them down wherever I could, and again creating that gray area.
It's very interesting, and especially like I haven't played the game, but now I'm very keen on doing that. How I think this idea of merging, but also like the edge condition there is very interesting to understand, because when I'm looking at the two screens that you'd created, Miss, um, where one ends and the other starts, there's a very smooth transition that you did. I don't know how that happened, but if you look at it at, at one go, you don't feel that they're two different worlds. They're just probably parallel worlds, and we all live in those parallel worlds probably. So I think that was something that was intriguing for me.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You can almost think of like the parallel worlds existing in this like larger entire monitor space, right?
Yeah.
Where they're still contained in the same, you know, area visually, but still kind of distinct and blending together, and then literally blending together when the two characters meet. But yeah, I'd love to hear what Dylan has
Yeah.
to say kind of about the visual elements of their VR experience.
Yeah, thank you. So the original concepts for Mementorium were actually so like I made those in a VR painting application called Tilt Brush, and so I was able to be in the space as I was drawing it around me, and sort of seeing how that felt. And what I was trying to do is basically Mementorium is like it's a dream space, and as you're entering sort of the first part of it, it's supposed to be like a real like a recreation of your bedroom. It's meant to feel cozy. It's meant to feel safe. It's meant to feel very like familiar. And of course, not everyone's bedroom looked the same, but it's got the familiar elements of the bed here, the dresser there, that kind of thing. In that space, you are interacting with very sort of normative objects. You've got your computer. You interact with the computer the way that you should interact with a computer, with a mouse and a keyboard. But then when you go into this other space, this magical realm, that's where I wanted to sort of push this magical realism. And we drew a lot from designs in movies and sort of books that I've read, as I'm very interested in magical realism and sci-fi and that kind of stuff. And so thinking about how can we take the everyday objects of the initial room and then make them just kind of just that bit, a little bit different, that bit a little bit magical. The computer game is pulled out of the computer and becomes a floating, story in front of you, with large buttons that you interact with, that kind of thing. But at the same time, it's this liminal space where elements of the bedroom have come through with you, and you still see your bed is there, even though you're in this vast prairie landscape. And the dresser is still there. And so there's this kind of, it's meant to be this liminal space where there's room for possibility. Things can change. And so your interactions have new possibilities for where they can go. We don't have to recreate the past.
And then, Dylan, do you think were you trying to resort to a little bit of an estrangement of familiar objects, or making things which we are so adapted to in our day-to-day lives, you make people rethink that? Is that how you describe it? Is that what you were trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, and this is what's so neat about VR, is that it allows for you to really change the way that we interact with things. We're so, especially with computers, we're so used to interacting with a computer screen, and that's our way of understanding the screen, the world, the objects. It's all contained within this box, and so that became one way. The technology allowed for this different kind of storytelling, where the objects could become something else. We could imagine a different way of interacting.
Very interesting. Going back on the duality that also we've been talking about, there's a different kind of duality that I feel in between academia and practice or the industry. And then both of you probably can bring in perspectives from those two different worlds. And I was wondering what were some of the challenges as well as, possibilities being in these different kinds of worlds. And how do you comment on, say, let's start with Dylan probably, and talking about more research focused academic engagements rather than probably when Maze talks about more of an industry-based setting.
Yeah, it is a duality. There is such a separation, and it's a shame because I feel like as someone who lives very much in both, I think there's a lot that they offer to each other, and I don't, personally, separated from all of the rest of the way that these are set up, I personally don't experience that duality in my own work. My research informs my designs inform my research. And there is a complete, weaving and flowing between those. But when it comes to sort of interfacing with any aspect of academia or industry, there's really, that's where things start to become split. That's where it's, okay, now I'm in the academic space. I have to, think a certain way, speak a certain way, like present ideas a certain way. And same goes for industry. We have these different ways of being in each of those spaces that you kind of have to play to. And it's, as someone who is queer and does queer theoretical work, I'm always sort of interested in how do we break down those binaries? How do we operate across? How do we keep things fluid? And it doesn't make sense to me that it's so separated, but it is.
Maze?
Yeah, I think me and Dylan's experience are actually like pretty similar. Like, I had never worked in a games production environment that was like based in the industry. I had a little bit of experience working in it in kind of an academic context as part of larger research projects about, working with Indigenous youth and showing them, some of the ways of making games and, being a part of that process as well. So I think, yeah, Dylan and I definitely bumped up into a lot of similar things as it relates to like our project specifically and like kind of how Terra Nova was created. I like to say that it was like a student game, so like go easy on the critiques. It's like quite buggy. And I think that comes down to like resourcing as well, because like I only had 8 months, very short time, because if I wanted to graduate within like kind of a reasonable amount of time, I needed to like call it at some point. Okay, like this is the scope, this is how far we're going. We're going to leave some things off to the side and ignore them for now because like I just can't work on them anymore. I have to like start writing. I have this whole backlog of notes that I need to go over. Like, okay, it's time to move on to the next phase of this research creation project. So when it comes to industry, I think it's like really interesting for me now as someone who works at Unity. They provide the game engine platform that I created, Terra Nova, and I suspect many of Dylan's projects are created in as well. It's one of those tools that are like, it's quite easy to pick up, and it's free for users who aren't using it in an industry capacity, like for just like education and learning or just like hobbyist stuff. But I'm not working with those types of people, or like very rarely in my position. Like I'm working and supporting projects that are very much designed to make money, and kind of getting exposed to the industry as someone who works as like a technology service like provider. and basically like advocating for their needs. So some of the problems that that they care about were things that I just did not think about or care about when I was making my game, because I had other limitations that were kind of defined by the academy as an institution rather than industry and profit as like institutions.
That's very interesting to hear. Thank you both. I'm going to ask a question that probably I'm trying hard to figure out in my mind, but probably it's a fun question. I would say, if you were to rethink of your games without the digital tools, what form would it probably take? I'm probably putting you on the spot, but or do you think it won't be a possibility, or it'll have a different kind of a feel altogether? But
if I had more experience with like cinema and video production, I think it would have been cool to like shoot this as like a short movie or or something, kind of tell the similar story, but maybe yeah, do exactly the same thing with this great split screen perspective, but like do it in a way that you kind of see both visual, I don't know, yeah, both like shots of like Terra and Nova's perspectives as like a film instead of a game. I think that could be definitely possible. Or like poetry or something like that, like where you have you're jumping in between, or you have like parallel narratives happening through the poems, in a column or something like that. I think that could be really interesting too. But yeah, I think what I was really interested in, why I think this became a game, is because I did really want people to have that immersive experience as it related to experiencing a moment of first contact. And I think that's what makes this unique for games, is like you don't just get to passively experience what a first contact would be, and whatever the author or director of the story tells you what that experience is like you kind of get put into the situation, and from the perspective of these two characters, and you have a little bit of agency to make a decision about how you react to the other character, and by extension the other player that's you're like hopefully literally sitting beside.
Miss, also, if yes, a game definitely makes sense, but in the digital sense, like, do we need the digital to play the game? Sorry, I'm pushing here probably, but
it's a hard question.
It's a good question. It's a hard question. Maybe it's because I haven't expanded my mind yet to the possibilities. But again, I go back to like that first slide with me as a little kid. It's like the digital has always been there for me. Like this is the perspective that I bring. I'd love to work on a project that isn't digital and kind of tells a similar story, but maybe Dylan has an idea. I don't know. Sorry to put you on the spot.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I sort of imagine I think Terra Nova would make a really great like immersive theater experience, where you could have kind of you become part of the play, and there's the dual stages to set the sets side by side. Like I think you could do something with that, and I think when I think of Mementorium, there's certainly ways that you could probably bring it into a physical space and not rely on digital tools. You could have people exploring. Again, I think of theater. A lot of VR environmental design and the space, the environmental storytelling draws on the knowledge of theater. And I think like you could recreate that. I think what the digital offers is, you can create interactions that you can push the bounds of what's possible, something that's not possible in the physical world because of physics or just all kinds of things that just you can't do. Like in our game we have these fish that are like swimming in midair, and if you touch them they have a chime sound. Like that would be pretty hard to recreate. And so I think you know, it's certain, it's possible to do things without digital, but when you're working in the digital realm, you're really thinking about what are the affordances of the digital that allow me to push this narrative in a different way. And I think it also is a matter of like, you know, I can give this game to people to play in their own homes. And what does that do for the experience when you're playing something in your own home and you have potentially, you know, loved ones around you that you can discuss it with, that you can, you know, share it with in that moment. You can pause it and have a discussion that you might not be able to do in the same way in a physical space.
It's very interesting. Then probably we could have mazes split screen of like the physical adaptation of the game versus the digital adaptation. Like in my mind, that's started to play out. Katie, go ahead.
What I find really interesting about both of your answers is it shows where the importance lies for you in the games that you created. So for Maze, it's the narrative and the weaving between the two different perspectives and sides and comparing them. Whereas Dylan, it sounds for you, it's more of like the interaction with the environment. Actually, I picture a scene from an old movie. You probably don't know it, but Return to Oz. And there's this one scene. Oh, you know it? Okay. If you know it, it's part of your nightmares, I'm sure. Yes, it's like there's the one scene where there's all these white jars on the table and Dorothy is trying to find the jars that are her friends that have been converted, and she's picking them all up and interacting with them. And I picture that when I picture how Dylan's world, a mentorium, could be translated. And May's just the poetry idea too, but having that like visual and overlaying with like transparencies, could be incredible. The digital is, as you said, Dylan, there's tools that it gives us, and when we're making something for that, we're making it specific for it. So it never can be a true conversion. With that, I would like to ask if either of you have a question for the other, or comment or talking point. Dylan, do you have any questions for Maze?
I guess, I mean, there was lots of things that I connected with in Maze's talk and answers in this Q&A. And I guess one of the things that I think about with, you sort of talked about this at the end of your presentation, how when you're creating, as you know, you basically said, like, you lean into the identity, lean into your personal histories, your own stories, and there's a lot to sort of bring to a game experience there. And I wonder what your thoughts are, what your experience was of feeling potentially some kind of any pressures, like as a you know, a marginalized creator, to sort of represent something beyond yourself. So like, how do you balance that? Like, this was my personal story, but I know it's not everyone's. And how do I represent this story without, like, you know, with the pressures of like, oh, well, this is an Indigenous game or this is a queer game. So, you know, how do I represent all people? Which you can't, obviously, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, really good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for it, but I definitely felt the pressure. Not only like, okay, I'm going to make a game, you know, that I lead for the first time. And I'm going to see how it goes. And I'm going to fail many times and, you know, hopefully learn from it. But yeah, narratively speaking, like, is it Indigenous enough, or is it like coming from a perspective of like being mixed enough? Because like, that's kind of the perspective I brought to it, is like that mixedness of my own identity. So it was definitely like an ongoing process. Like I didn't have all the answers when I like kind of built out the framework. It kind of just fell into that. And then I was like, okay, like there's some really interesting things that I can start fleshing out from both perspectives. And I was nervous, especially before it like started getting out there and people started playing it, like how people would respond. Would they get it? Would they understand it? And I actually don't know the answer to that. I've been, asked to do these types of talks, and I find it really helpful for like explaining why I made certain things, or why I made certain choices for the game design and the narrative design. But then also like why I even made this thing like in the first place. So the pressure is there, when you fold yourself into these projects, um, because yeah, it's not everyone's experience. You don't know if everyone's going to understand it, and I think that's okay. Like I think we could really play. I think that's one of the great things about doing our own research projects in this way and in kind of this academic, um, framework, is that what we create is oftentimes really great material for other research that can it's a continuous like line and trajectory and growth cycle, whereas with industry there's always someone in marketing or like in communications or like in focus groups and doing like quality assurance and user experience research who says like we can't do the game like this because it'll alienate this type of player that we're like trying to extract money from. And it's like, wow, okay, interesting. There's some real limitations there. So I did feel particularly free in this case to kind of just make the thing that I was going to make, and it was going to be what it was going to be. And I could really like talk about the failures that happened during the process because it was my first time, not as though that's like an excuse, but it's like it's a reality, right? I want to just be real and say like these are some of the things that worked, these are some of the things that didn't. And yeah, the storytelling element that leaned into my identity was definitely part of that, and being vulnerable was hard. But I think overall, it was worth it because I feel like I've heard people come to me and say that it was a valuable piece of media, for them to experience, and that makes it all worth it, right? Like showing it at Imaginative, I think was like the highest point of this. So Imaginative is like this film and media arts festival, and they had like an interactive media space, and this game was featured in the 2019 festival, and just the amount of people I spoke to about it, throughout the week there, I really got the sense that they, were getting the things that I was hoping that they'd get out of it, and that just made it all worth it because it wasn't me just talking about it in this closed academic environment, but like it was public, like it was something that people were experiencing, and they didn't know walking into that space that they were going to see it or interact with this thing, and they did, and the outcome was pretty cool, pretty valuable to me at least. And yeah, so maybe I guess I'll switch gears and ask Dylan a question then. What's next for you? You're still working on this project, but I'm sure you have a lot of ideas constantly. What's kind of like coming up, and maybe there's like a preview you could give us.
Yeah, that's a scary question because I'm like nearing the end of my dissertation, and so what's next is like, big career choices, and I don't really know what the answer is going to be there, but I am developing new ideas and thinking about new projects, and at the same time being like, no, you don't have time for that. You have to wait until you've written the dissertation. But my team and I are sort of working on other projects. Over the pandemic, we did some other work that was not directly related to my research on gender and sexuality, and was more like, so we've been making things for social VR spaces. So we have some educational worlds about space, about some of the NASA missions. And we've been doing some like sort of collaborative, really like short collaborative games that are just fun and silly. And I think it's just at this point, it's like continuing to develop my skills as a game developer, so that my next sort of bigger project, I'll have the skills for, to push that a little further. Because I think, as you've mentioned, like when you're starting out with sort of your first game, or you're first learning the tools, and you're trying to like make it work, and you run into a lot of problems, and there's a lot of times that you fail. And that's part of the process, I think, no matter what. Like, even as you get more advanced, you're just pushing the bounds that much further, and so you run into different problems. But I think, it's just the little bits of sort of thinking through this work, and thinking about, what is this going to lead to next? And I'm kind of interested in. I've been moving between different projects. I didn't get to talk about some of the other projects, but those were a little bit more of documentary style, and collecting people's stories from around the community. And so this working with that, which is like multiple stories, multiple perspectives, to the Mementorium, which was a bit more of a fiction, a single narrative. And so I'm kind of thinking through, like, how do I continue to work within this fiction space, but maybe drawing from some of that multiple perspectives of the other work that I've done.
Yeah, the learning of a game developer never ends, and it's the case, like, with everyone I've spoken to who works in games, is like there's always a new tool to learn. There's always new functions and code to kind of pick apart and test things out and incorporate into kind of like your repertoire of skills. Super multidisciplinary medium, because there's so many just creative elements to it: writing, design, coding, art, sound, like, and then the whole like production and like project management element too. So yeah, I understand that struggle. And it's probably the reason why I haven't done any projects since Terra Nova. It's like, it's just too much. I'm just like, I think I've kind of settled into accepting that while I really enjoy being creative, I think I enjoy supporting creators more. And I think I found like a really nice fit at Unity where I get to do that every day. But I still love to do this too, because I think I have some interesting things to talk about and share with people. And I'm happy to do it when I'm asked. So yes, I definitely identify with the unknowingness of this field. Yeah, it's just so dynamic and ever changing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a real challenge, because there's so many different aspects to it, like different elements to producing a game. Even a small project is a big undertaking, and so yeah, it's a real challenge. And then to try and also do that while finding funding, trying to work within industry spaces. Is an added challenge to that.
I think that funding is one of the main things that makes it the difference between industry and academia when it comes for games, because as you guys mentioned, how is it marketable? And it's an annoying statement to ask, and frankly, it's not like I identify with Mario from like Mario. So it shouldn't matter. We all identify to the stories, and we should all be able to express them. So hopefully through more talks like this, more projects like this, and bridging the gap between academia and like the game industry, then maybe the question of who it speaks to won't really be the loudest question anymore. Due to thinking of the time, I think we can wrap it up now. Pallavi, do you have any other, like a quick question you wanted to ask before? I don't want to cut you off in case you do.
No, I think we have an interesting conversation that can go on, but we should take it up probably. We are also planning a publication coming out of this, so hopefully gets a chance for us to continue the conversation in that format. And but very interesting pointers that your work has brought in for us. Thank you both.
And I wanted to say thank you both very much for being here today. This is an exciting way for us to end the webinar series because both of you work so much more in the digital and kind of the future of where things are going. As you're saying, who knows, you have to keep learning. There's always something new coming out, and that's an exciting place to be. So thank you both very much for being here. The webinar is recorded and available for after, and there'll be future conversations. Dylan and Maze, do you have any final thoughts or remarks? Dylan, I'll let you go first.
Just that I wanted to say thank you so much to both Katie and Pallavi for organizing this, for inviting us here, for creating this space for a very interesting conversation. I really appreciated that. Thank you to Maze for everything that you brought to this conversation as well. It was so interesting. I could probably talk with you for hours more. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for this time.
Yes, I echo those sentiments as well. Go for having me. I feel lucky to be here.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll hopefully have more conversations post and all of that. So have a good rest of the summer, and we'll see you again.
Thank you.